Hello, family of faith. Curt Bragg, Elder here, coming to you with this week's Reflect, and we're going where we look back at this week's service, on Sunday's service, and we just kind of go into some discussion on a little in depth on some of the topics that Pastor Osway brought up, or whoever the speaker was. In this case, it was Pastor Osway, and we're just going to highlight some topics that he talked about and try to spark some interest in the message again. I encourage you to review the message Sunday. It's a powerful message. They always are, but and I always say that. However, I really think there was some very impactful things that were discussed and shared throughout the service and in the message mainly, that I want to bring to light today and just kind of bring my point of view on some of that. And once again, if you have any questions, just please submit those to the church, #reflect. There's several ways to do it. If you run into somebody at church and you want to submit a question, feel free to ask any of the people around there, the ushers or greeters or something like that, or myself if you see me. So anyway, we'll get right into it. The message was basically around kind of our goals for 2023, and not just our goals, but our goals and our passions, what God's called us to do. And however, it was packaged a little bit around this year's goals, but it's basically what has God asked us to do, and what is hindering us from accomplishing that task or those tasks, whether it be ministry, whether it be a job, whether it be a business that we're supposed to start, or really whatever that may be. And so a lot of a basis of the message was about how fear can hold us back, and so I want to talk about that a little bit. How fear can cripple us, or it can empower us. We have the ability to really to take that and do with it what we want, because we're not supposed to be afraid. The Bible says that, and that was we went into that in the message. And however, it had the Christmas theme around it. The whole thing was in that particular message was about how those around Mary and especially Elizabeth, fear not, you're with child, and the most some of the most impactful things you could ever experience, obviously, is written in those words, where Mary's with child, Elizabeth was with child with John the Baptist, and how in her old age, being impossible for her to, in the natural, for her to become pregnant with what would appear to be a barren womb, and how people around her, and maybe not to her face, to Elizabeth's face, but around her, deemed her as barren, and said that she can't have children, and basically making that statement throughout, and becoming somewhat of her who she is. And what has people said about you and who you are that's hindering you, or that may be that place or barrier between you and what God's called you to do? What's people calling you, and more importantly, what are you calling yourself? Because that is a greater hinderer to your goal and to reaching what God's called you to do, than really what others say. Because only what you believe and what others say, and what you put to that belief, it will actually stop you from accomplishing those things that God set out for you to do, and where God's asked you maybe to birth something, and you feel that it's gone past you. Maybe something God's asked you to do, you feel that He gave you the tools to accomplish that, but you didn't yield to it at the time, and you let it pass, and now guess what? You feel that's not going to come back around. And God can make that come back around, but what are you saying about yourself? That can be our biggest problem, is what we say about ourselves. I see that in a lot of people. I've seen it in myself. I've had to stop myself from some things that I said, whether it's how you're talking and speaking about your finances. I never get a break, what's some things you say? Just think about some of the things you may say about your life and wondering why it doesn't change, but you keep saying the same things over and over again. And so, we know some of the things that God's called us to do. We know some of the blessings that God has spoken over our lives, but yet, what are we speaking? And where do we have our faith? And sometimes I think it's more comfortable for us to put our faith in fear than it is to put our faith and believe in what God's asked us to do. Fear and comfortability seem to go hand in hand, and sometimes, and the reason why I say that is that fear can drive you back into a comfort zone, a place that you do not want to move from because of that fear, and sometimes we associate fear with pain, and it becomes painful. That type of anxiety sometimes can be painful to our emotions, and so we shrink back, and we don't press forward. What if we were able to see fear for what it is and not be afraid? It's not wrong to see fear for what it is. It's wrong where we take it. And I think that going from fear to afraid is basically believing in the fear, because now you've put something with that fear. We can talk about fear. We can talk about fear in others. That doesn't change how it affects us. But when we say we're afraid, now we've believed that fear. And now that fear can disable us from being who God's called us to be. If we look at it for what it is, and we also understand where God has taken us through times like that, the fear of the unknown was something that was brought up Sunday, and we've talked about it a few times here in recent weeks on Reflect. The fear of the unknown, and some people that doesn't bother as much as others, but I think the unknown always has that level of fear built into it, and it's because it does take us out of a comfortability. What if we become comfortable in doing what God's called us to do, and then we wouldn't, fear would not be a part of that. And we may, like I said, see that as fear, but we wouldn't be so encompassing to us that we would become afraid. And so, so when you look at fear and you say, there's people that have fears about many things, and I don't want to discount anybody that has something medically that some sort of imbalance that creates a certain type of fear and anxiety that they're dealing with, that God's working with them to heal. However, most of the time that is rooted out of just a typical fear, not all the time, but when you see somebody, I heard of somebody, and this, true story, I heard somebody that they were a fear of making left-hand turns. Now, they made all of their routes to wherever they went, and this was somebody that was local, where they would only make right-hand turns. Why would, And so we look at that and we say, well, that's silly. But we do the same thing. What's God saying about the little thing that we're keeping that may look big to us because that fear of turning left was big to that person? But what does that look like in heaven when you look down and see the things that we're allowing to stop us, and just on the other side of that's victory, just on the other side of that's the blessing that we've been believing for. And what does that look like from heaven? Does that look like this great big thing that we've made it out to be, or is that just as simple as not making a left-hand turn? So, there, and you can go on with things that we may mention or see somebody else that, they're afraid of heights, or they're afraid of this, or they're afraid of that. And those are just types of fears that somebody may have physically. Spiritually, those fears can also hinder us from taking on, from diving into some sort of career that the Lord's called us to do, or ministry, taking chances, and God's called us to do that. If you look back, where do you even stop when you look back at people in the Bible that God hasn't asked to take chances? Noah, hadn't rained. I need you to build this boat, and this is how I want you to build it. And so, people were calling him stuff, threatening him, but yet he continued on. Those types of things can, when God asks us to do something, it can always have a level of fear, or there's always going to be a level of unknown, and some people that's going to translate to fear. There's people that came to God with their fears of their inabilities, like Moses, for instance, that said, I can't speak, I stutter, how can I lead your people, And so, and you can see where that, once again, it's not an issue. It's an issue that we made it, but it's not an issue, it's not an issue to God. God wants to use us in the manner by which we are, and He's going to, He'll make what He wants to make out of that if we allow Him. And so, we don't want to have more faith in our fear than we do in believing God, and that's important. Some of the other things that I think that that we talked about Sunday, or that were mentioned on Sunday, was that there's just that level of not knowing can also hinder us from moving forward, because we're afraid that, and I say afraid, sometimes it's not even the fear, we want to make sure that it's going to be victorious, I should say. And what if we fail? What if I'm not hearing God? Those type of things. And so a kind of a different course where we may in fear say, well, we know what our stumbling block is, and that's why we're not going to go forward, and that type of fear. And another type of fear is we don't know what, it's the fear of the unknown, and when we get out there, how do we know that we're going to be able to make it? That type of unknown. And so in that, it's just a trust in God. It's just a trust in God, like I said with Moses. It's basically just putting our faith that God's going to see us through whatever that may be. And I remember a time in my life when I took a job that was a lateral movement. In the natural, it looked very, like, why would you switch jobs for the same pay and less benefits? I mean, that doesn't make sense. Who would do that, right? And I knew it was the right thing to do, and I didn't base it upon the decision. I didn't base my decision upon necessarily that it was not more income. I felt there was a standard that I had to meet there, and that was met. And I took the job, and when I did, there was peace about it, and it seems that is a way a lot of times that we can know that we're following after God. It's not the way. It's a way that helps guide us, and that was a way that I knew I was on. I was doing what God wanted me to do. I had peace about it before, and I had done some things in the natural to try to figure out what this step would look like, but yet then I just trusted God. And I think that's where we get confused, is that God's given us a brain. He's given us the physical capabilities of putting things together and understanding things. But He doesn't want that to be the only source. It needs to be a tool that we use with our faith. And so and not allow it to override our faith. And that's, I think, one of the confusing parts, and I've stumbled with that myself. But in this case, it was just a few weeks down the road that this became paramount, or became very obvious, I should say, that this, even in the natural, was the right job. I mean, I took it because I knew that that's what I was supposed to do, and all this, but God began to open up doors of blessing over and over again as I continued in that line of work. And I've seen that throughout. It's been something that God's done in me as far as taking on, looking at certain types of occupations, and He's taken me through a lot of different doors, if you will, and I've seen Him work in various ways, where one job even, I knew I was called there, and it was very apparent that the doors were going to close in a matter of a few weeks and maybe less to this business. Everybody was let go but me and another guy, and the other guy was a relative, and so in all intents and purposes, the doors were going to shut, right? It was going to close down, and it was definitely going to happen, as far as in the natural. And I hadn't had I knew I wasn't supposed to go out and look for a job. I wasn't really looking for a job. I had my ears open, and I had my my heart was basically listening for my heart and my ears were trying to figure out what my next move would be, if there was one, but I was staying steadfast where I was called to be at the time. And I had a guy approach me about the same particular job that I was doing, actually where I'm working currently, and asked me if I wanted to work there, and then I felt a release. But once again, I didn't actually go out and look for anything, and it may sound totally upside down. The business is closing down, you need to go do this, this, and this, and I just had peace that God was going to take care of this, and I was, the job came to me, and so these aren't, obviously that's not exactly what Moses was dealing with, or exactly what Noah was dealing with, but in these instances, it parallels with how God will use us if we just allow the process to work, and not get fearful. What's your greatest fear, and why is it? And I think that's a valid question that you need to answer on your own. Is what's your biggest fear, and why is that your fear? And what's the foundation of that fear? Why is it there? And you can't just go to something because there's resistance and try to push through it because fear's there and say, well, on the other side. But on the other hand, you need to ask the question, why is that fear there? It's if you've become afraid, if you've allowed that fear to fester, to be afraid, then what are you afraid of? What's the root cause of that? And can you see a way to victory? And ask God to show you what you need to do to overcome that, because sometimes it's things that you think are very ancillary, very on the fringe, that have nothing to do with where you believe God's called you to do, that you need to get victory over in order to get to the place where God has called you. So anyway, hopefully this helps. Have a good week, and let's go strong into 2023 here, and conquer our fears, and let's go into what God's called us to do and be fruitful.